I think it's safe to say that Seiko fans love their field watches, as my reviews of the SNK, SNZG, and Alpinist are some of my best performing videos ever. So when I heard there was going to be a brand new Seiko 5 field watch, I grabbed one as soon as I could find it. And this was not what I was expecting. I'm Shane, this is Relative Time, and today we're going to look at the brand new Seiko 5 SRPG29, which I will be giving away to one of you. So make sure you stick around until the end just to find out how to enter the contest. Now, before we jump into this, there's one very important thing to note. In fact, if you take anything away from this video, this is what you need to know. That with the new Seiko 5 field watches, there are major differences between the ones that come on a NATO and the ones that come on a bracelet. Dave from Just the Watch was kind enough to let me use some footage of his that's on a NATO. And here you can see that it has a blasted case, a matte textured dial, and flat painted indices, which is more of what you'd be expecting, as I think it's in line with the Seiko SNKs and SNZGs. Whereas those that come on a bracelet have a mixture of brushed and polished surfaces, as well as reflective metallic indices, and a sunburst dial that beautifully pairs with the domed crystal. It's more of a dressed up field watch, and in that regard I think it might have more in common with a Hamilton Khaki King, or even an Alpinist than its Seiko 5 siblings. And that's really what surprised me here, as I was expecting more SNZG than Khaki King. Now if you haven't seen Dave's review, after you're done here, go check it out. And that way you can get a good take on one that's on a NATO, as well as the one that's on a bracelet. But for now, let's check this one out. First off, let's talk about specs, and I think this is one of the more interesting aspects of the watch. Before this one was released, Seiko's most popular affordable field watches were the SNKs and SNZGs. While they are great in their own right, a lot of people, including myself, kind of feel that the 37mm SNKs were too small and the 42mm SNZGs were a little too big. So Seiko automatically created kind of a Goldilocks watch here by going with a width of 39.5mm. And that's also right in line with Seiko's Alpinist collection. You're also looking at a lug-to-lug of 47.6 and a total thickness of 13.5. Although I think it wears a little slimmer than that, as it's 13.5mm from the exhibition case back to the top of a slightly domed crystal. So there is a slightly slimmer profile to the case, and overall should be a great fit for most people. Now, rounding everything out, the watch has 100 meters of water resistance, 20mm lugs, and a moderate weight of 140 grams on its bracelet. So while wearing it on the wrist, you definitely know it's there, but it's something that you can easily wear all day. Although in the summer months, you might want to swap that out to something more lightweight and more breathable. Either way, it's very comfortable on the wrist, and with my 7.25-inch wrist, I think it really does fit that Goldilocks profile, as it's not too big, yet not too small either. It just sits squarely where it needs to be and has a great presence. A lot of which can be attributed to the slight distortion in the crystal, which is then combined with an expansive dial that takes up most of the space under the crystal, rather than having a chapter ring act as a buffer. Moving on to the case, I'd say it's very simple and very straightforward, and kind of representative of what a modern Seiko is these days. And this one has a build quality that's on par with the more recent Dress KX line. Now the finishing is pretty good for the price, and I was actually surprised to see that there weren't too many sharp edges on this one. Except for the very edge of the lugs, everything has a nice rounded feel to it. Now with the bracelet versions you have a polished sidewall, and at this angle, you can also see the drilled lugs, which is always nice to see, and something Seiko has been doing more of lately. Then moving to the top of the case, you can see it has a circular brushing, which also matches the circular brushing that's on the clean bezel, and that bezel does hold the Hardlicks crystal. And yes, I did say Hardlicks. At this point, that really shouldn't be a surprise to anyone. I mean, that is one of the big negatives against this watch, but it is typical Seiko, so there's only so much you can say. Another negative about this crystal is that it is pretty reflective, and it does add a bit of glare that otherwise wouldn't be there, which I think is pretty apparent in some of this footage. And along the same lines, the metallic indices can reflect lights in awkward ways, where a couple of times I actually found them reflecting sunlight directly into my eyes. However, despite that, and despite the Hardlicks part of that crystal, the domed part is pretty nice. And it's one of the things that makes this watch much more interesting than its flatter siblings. The crystal's not very tall, but it adds just the right amount of distortion to make the metallic indices really pop when you look at them, as well as enhances the sunburst effect on the dial, So with this design over the NATO version, there is some give and take here. Looking at the right side of the watch, there's a somewhat smaller sized crown with some basic knurling. And unsurprisingly, it isn't signed, especially with Seiko at this price. But it's just tall enough and just wide enough that it's always easy to get a hold of and use. Then moving to the rear, you can see the exhibition case back. And here it's a typical Seiko exhibition case back with all the normal particulars, as well as you can get a glimpse of the 4R36 movement. Now, a solid case back would probably be better, but this is an entry-level automatic, which means they usually like to show off the movement, as seeing the thing move and breathe, so to speak, is kind of what gets people hooked on automatics, so I can't really blame them for that. Now, the dial is where things really get interesting, and remember with this bracelet version, it has a sunburst dial over the flat one on the NATO, and I think that's going to give it a very different feel. Now, with the SRPG29, you have a very dark blue dial. It's so dark that at times it almost looks black, and here it is accompanied by a combination of silver and white accents. Now, at the very outer edge of the dial, you have a chaptering that is mostly painted on in silver, except for the hour markers, which are a raised metallic frame that is then filled with white luminous paint, which, by the way, is the only part of the dial that is lumed. So these Arabics here don't have any lume applied. However, they do have a very cool look to them. Looking dead on at this light and this angle, they look almost white, but they really have a brushed metallic surface, and that lets them play with the light in very interesting ways, and pairs beautifully with the domed crystal. Moving just inward from the indices, you can see that Seiko has decided to keep this very much in line with a classic field watch design. As here you have small Arabics for the 24-hour indicators, and they are painted on in silver. And that's right before you get to the slightly controversial new Seiko 5 logo. A lot of people prefer the older Seiko 5 logo, but I gotta be honest, this one has grown on me, and at this point, I do prefer it. I think it's a little more modern and a bit more stylish, and I think that fits the newer Seiko 5 style perfectly. Although, it really doesn't help the dial from looking a tad crowded. It's very symmetrical, but very crowded. And part of that is due to the day date at the right, which winds up taking a lot of space, and I'm not really sure that silver framing is helping at all. But despite that, it really wouldn't be a Seiko 5 without a day date. And on a watch this small, you gotta use the space you have. Although I do appreciate that they went with a black date wheel here, as it helps it blend in just a tad. Then topping everything off, you have a set of sword-shaped hands. And these also have a rougher brush metallic surface, and that does match the indices nicely, as well as a very long red-tipped arrow second hand, and I think that adds just the right amount of color here. There's also one cool but small touch that took me a while to notice. If you look at the hour hand, you can see that it's segmented, but look at the very back section, and you'll notice that it's cut perfectly to match the counterweight of the minute hand. It's a small thing, but I think it is a nice touch. Now, overall the design is very classic field watch, and I think that is true about both versions, but the bracelet version does things a little bit differently, as it adds a lot of little elements that love to play with the light, and I think that's the reason that this is the more interesting one to get. There are a lot of classic looking field watches out there at a wide range of prices. However, if you're looking for something that's a little more of an elegant field watch, a dressier field watch if you will, there's only two that I really know about in the affordable spectrum, and that's the Hamilton Khaki King and the Seiko Alpinist. So this makes this a very interesting and cheaper option to those two watches, compared to the NATO version, which is still a good field watch, but it's much more common. Although I can tell you without a doubt that I do prefer my Hammy Khaki King and my Alpinist to this one. For some reason, this dial at times can occasionally look washed out, and other times it looks simply brilliant. Yet my Hammy and my Alpinist, those look great no matter what angle you're looking at them. So I think this is a very interesting design and a very interesting field watch, but at this price there are going to be some compromises, at least compared to the Hamilton and the Alpinist. Anyway, let's move on to the Lume, and this is one area that I was pretty curious about. And it's also another area that's different than the NATO version. Dave pointed out that on his, he has a dual Lume color setup, and mine is just one, which is kind of a strange thing to do between the two versions, but either way the Lume is pretty good for what it is. Now unfortunately this isn't a torch like the SNZGs, but that is kind of expected. The only thing on this dial that has Lume are those little tiny squares, as opposed to the SNZGs where the Arabics were all loomed up. And unfortunately, those little lume squares do fade out early on, but the hands here do stay in it, and they fade out just before Turtle Diver. So considering that this is a field watch, I'd say it's good to go. Which is exactly what you can say about the movement. Now the 4R36 is exactly what you'd expect Seiko to do at this price. It's also one big advantage this watch has over its older Seiko 5 siblings, as the 4R36 adds hacking and hand winding, and that's something the older 7R movements lack. Which is also the biggest complaint I've heard about the older Seiko 5s, that if they only had hacking and hand winding, people would buy them more often. Now as for the bracelets, I kind of feel like a broken record here, but it's pretty much what you'd expect on a Seiko at this price. Which means there's a heavy emphasis on functional, and not so much on design. You have good-looking solid links that are secured with regular pins, but you do have folded end links and a pressed clasp. So it's not necessarily the best quality, but it is decent and very functional. However, one nice thing about the SRPG29 is that I think it looks great on a variety of straps. So if the bracelet starts to bother you, you can always swap it to something else. And that may include some aftermarket bracelets. I was kind of curious, so on a whim I tried my Strapcode bracelet for my Dress KX on this new Seiko 5 field watch. And for the most part, it does fit. There is a little bit of wiggle room with the end links, so it's not entirely the best fit, but I think it would work. However, I didn't extensively test it, so do approach this with some caution. Now in terms of value, well, it's a brand new Seiko, which means it is a little hard to talk about, as the prices should drop as time goes on and they become more available. Right now these are going for about $220 on eBay, and I think that's overall pretty decent, or at the very least it's Seiko decent, even with the Hardlux crystal. And I know that's something some people are going to disagree with. The thing is, from a functional standpoint, or maybe a durability standpoint, you guys are correct, it's sapphire or bust. However, from a monetary standpoint, I would dare say that this domed Hardlux crystal actually costs more than a flat sapphire would. And for me, that domed crystal is really what makes the watch so cool. The other thing to think about is who has a better field watch for less money. Now, outside the world of AliExpress, you're pretty much going to be looking at other Seiko 5s. And out of those, I think this is the best of the bunch. The only other field watch that immediately comes to mind is from Vaer, and those are almost as much. Now with Vaer, you will get a domed sapphire and a beautiful finishing on the case, but those are quartz. So like I said, in terms of value, this is Seiko decent. Overall, I think Seiko did a fantastic job with these. And for me, I think the bracelet version is the one to get. And especially if the prices ever start dropping. I think it's a great mixture of size, comfort, and presence. It's a great classic design that's dressed up just a little bit, enough to make it a great go anywhere and do anything kind of watch. And this one I think is especially going to be good for those that are on a budget. The only thing that I'd caution someone on is if they think they want a Khaki King or maybe an Alpinist later, that they do kind of stop and think about whether this is worth it now, or maybe saving up and getting one of those directly. Alright, so let's talk giveaway. Now I'll have the rules in more detail down below, but basically it's open to everyone worldwide. The only trick is that you need to have an address that the US Postal System will actually send mail to. International shipping is better than it was, but it's still not quite back to normal. So just bear that in mind. Now, in order to enter the contest, just leave a comment down below and include #relative-time. We'll let this go for about 3 weeks and then pick a winner. And that's it. You don't even have to be a subscriber, although I would appreciate it if you were. And you might want to join up anyways, otherwise you might miss when I announce the winner. And that about wraps it up for the SRPG29. Now, let me know your thoughts down below on the Seiko 5 field watches, as well as if you can think of a field watch that does it better for less. And as always, if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. I'm Shane, this is Relative Time, and good luck.